Welcome to the Dark Ages, where if you wear the color purple, you'll go to jail. And if you see a rat, you're probably gonna die in 3 days. Realistically, it was bad. It was really bad.
Terrible.
I'm your host today, Taylor McWaters.
And I'm Olivia Kozlowski. And here are the top 10 Dark Age traditions that will leave you confused.
Grossed out.
Confused.
Number 10, carrying a sword. Whenever we see medieval shows or hear stories or see art, everybody always has a sword at their side. I'll admit, on one hand, literally, it's pretty badass. Was this really that common though in the 12th century? Was everyone gifted a sword on their 16th birthday, like in Zelda Wind Waker? No, of course not. I mean, if you were traveling, sure, ideally you'd want a little dagger or a little something to help you out, but swords were a symbol of wealth and status. And the bigger and shinier the tune, the better, right? On average, these things would cost you 7 months worth of wages. So you best start saving up. And training. Yeah, you might want to train as well because these things were not light. No, not at all. Ideally, medieval swords would weigh 3 to 4 pounds. Doesn't sound like much at first, but I know after 8 minutes, I would be switching arms real quick. It's like when you hold your hand up in class, you're like, oh God, what's going on here? Gotta do some push-ups.
In our number 9 spot today, we have the death cage. If you were to take a look at the punishments used in history, it quickly becomes clear that people of the past just really liked watching people die or have pain inflicted upon them. It's very strange, it's very dark, and it certainly is not for the faint of heart. The death cage is just one of the many horrifying punishments used during the Dark Ages. Essentially, this was just one method of execution that was extremely public, as they would strip the person down and lock them in an iron cage that was placed somewhere that everyone would be able to see. From here, the condemned person would be locked in there with no food or water, and everyone would just watch as they slowly died. Unbelievably messed up for a multitude of reasons, for sure. Sometimes, to make matters even worse, however, the condemned person would also be slathered in milk and honey so that they would also be attracting insects, just to make the whole dying process even worse. It's all bad. I'm just thankful that those days are over.
Number 8, the summer of 1348, aka the Black Death. Now let's talk about this horrible event, shall we? If you thought summer 2020 sucked, well, buckle up, this one was pretty bad too. The bubonic plague arrived to medieval England in 1348, and the death toll here was absolutely devastating. Somewhere from 1/3 to half of England's population gone, just like that, and that's it. The plague hit hard and it hit fast. Now today we have variations of the virus, one we shall not name, but back then the plague was a bacterium now known as Yersinia pestis. Now symptoms were quite jarring. You got lumps in the groin or your armpits, so that can't be comfortable. And next, the infected would notice black spots appearing all over their body. Almost all that were infected died within 3 days. More often than not without a fever, so you wouldn't see it coming, aside from the black spots and the things I just said. Now, the drop in the population resulted in a widespread of wealth. Workers were demanding higher wages, and farmers were demanding lower rents. The poor got expandable income, so it kinda helped, kinda didn't. I don't know how to explain that. The Black Death spread more than a mile per day, and it's all thanks to traders and travelers. Yeah, humans can't stay still for a bit. We love traveling, even through the Black Death. Cause you know, why not? Roads are empty. As long as there aren't any rats hiding on board, maybe you'll make it.
In our number 7 spot today, we have the Meowing Nuns. Mass hysteria wasn't necessarily uncommon in the Dark Ages. There are a few instances we could discuss, but for today I want to talk about one of my favorites. In the book, The Epidemics of the Middle Ages, which was written by J.F. Hecker in 1844, there was the description of a very strange case of mass hysteria that broke out among nuns in a French convent in the Middle Ages. Basically, one day a nun in this French convent started to meow like a cat. I'm not sure why, I'm not sure how this started, all I know is that it happened. And you know what else happened? Other nuns in the convent began to also meow like cats. Eventually it became such a thing that all of the nuns in the convent would meow together for a certain period of time. And of course, everyone surrounding this area was like, what in the absolute heck is going on right now? This is actually a huge problem because in these times, cats were hated. People associated cats with the devil and with disease, so a bunch of meowing nuns was like the equivalent of doomsday. Apparently, the way that this stopped was that the police came and threatened to whip the nuns if the meowing didn't stop, which is definitely one of the weirdest things I've ever said.
Number 6. Peddlers. Ah yes, that medieval businessman just wandering along in the pine forest in hopes of not getting robbed. A classic image from medieval times. The Dark Ages were a dangerous game, right? So one could only imagine how hard it must have been for a merchant who travels the countryside for a living to sell goods. In Breath of the Wild, you're like, oh thank God, there's that one guy with all the goods that I need. How convenient is this? Awesome. That's not in real life. In the Middle Ages, traveling village to village wasn't an easy task. You couldn't order an Uber and then voila, and unless you were a knight, you probably didn't have a noble steed to take you there. But even so, an outsider showing up to your village to sell goods from a distant land, I don't know, sounds a little sus if you ask me personally. Peddlers were more often than not welcomed with suspicion by locals. Most of the time, peddlers were just accused of being criminals, even if they weren't. Guy shows up, he's like, hey, wanna buy some watches? They're like, you're a robber, you're going away.
In our number 5 spot today, we have donations. In the Dark Ages, it wouldn't necessarily be strange to either donate or sell your own urine. Yeah, the market was hot for urine because they used it a bunch during this time in history. Medieval chamber pots would collect all of the stuff from an entire household or public space wherever they were placed, and oftentimes they could later be sold at the local tanner or fuller in town. I mean, talk about an easy way to make some money, but how horrible. The reason this product was so popular is because it was used in a variety of ways. It could be used to clean clothing, to help with the dyeing process, to tan leather hides, and like I spoke about in a recent video, be used to help in the cotton making process in order to make the material soft and not frayed. While the practical uses make the wholesale process a little less peculiar, it honestly still would just be weird to have to sell your own pee or your neighbor's pee.
Number 4, color coordinated. I get it, on Wednesdays we wear pink. It's nice to add a little color into your schedule at work, in the office. It's fun, sure, have at it. In medieval times, they were serious about their looks and colors. There was no around back then. Having rules about what colors and what type of clothing and hats you could wear, you named it. It was all based on your occupation or social level. Some colors were banned for certain professions. Imagine that. For example, imagine if you were a night worker, right? If I can say that, a woman, lady of the night. You weren't allowed to wear certain styles or colors. That's hilarious. Hey, welcome to Ontario. We don't wear jeans here. Got it? All right, now get in. 15th century English law banned knights or anybody below knights from wearing velvet, which is so random to me and so funny looking back now. Imagine that. And you may know this one, but purple was a fancy color back then. Purple has been associated with royalty even since the ancient world. Natural purple dye was rare, and medieval Europeans believed that mixing dyes was unnatural and diabolic. It was a no-no. So they were missing out on purple for quite a while because they didn't want to, you know, mixed goods, if I can say that.
In our number 3 spot today, we have divorce by combat. If you talk to most people who are divorced nowadays, they'll tell you about how awful the divorce proceedings can be. It's expensive, it's time consuming, and sometimes things get pretty heated. While these harrowing tales are definitely less than delightful, things could definitely be worse, and by worse, I mean you could be getting a divorce in the Dark Ages by way of combat. The first documented instance of this was created by Hans Talhofer in a 1467 manuscript. He wrote, quote, "As per the instructions, the husband was put up to his waist in a 3-foot wide hole dug in the ground with one hand tied behind his back. The woman was to be armed with 3 rocks, each weighing between 1 and 5 pounds, and each one wrapped in cloth." Basically, the man couldn't leave the hole, but the woman could run around the edge of the pit. He continued on, quote, "If the man touched the edge of the pit with either his hand or arm, he had to surrender one of his clubs to the judges. If the woman hit him with a rock while he was doing so, she forfeited one of her stones." While this sounds like an insane process, it really was true and continued on before growing rare in the early 13th century. Not only has the discovery of this historical practice shed light on something we previously did not know, but it also gives us a glimpse into the gender dynamics of the time period. We're not entirely sure how this sort of divorce ended, but many speculate that this basically continued on until one of them died or one of them surrendered.
Number 2, bucket family style. For my last one today, we're getting real cozy. Real cozy. Remember in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory when all his grandparents have to share that one rickety old bed? Well, that's what everybody at home looked like in the Dark Ages. Imagine being in the middle. I'm already anxious thinking about it, just stuck. I mean, think about it though. Back then, space was so limited. Warmth is also a plus in those winter nights. And beds, they were massive. They were made of straw and wood. It was a whole thing. It was a whole situation. It's not like you could fit more than one of these in your home. No way, Jose. Even in the royal household, this was a common theme. King King Richard I of England and King Philip II of France both had to sleep in the same bed as an act of diplomacy. Again, I would be so anxious and awkward there. I'd be like, oh, excuse me, Mr. King guy, you're snoring too loud.
In our number 1 spot today, we have affairs of the court. If you know anything about marriage in the Dark Ages, you know that love was often not a part of it. To sort of piggyback off my last point, if you were in a loveless marriage, like most everyone else was in the time, but didn't want to go through the process of beating your spouse to a pulp or any of the other divorce methods at the time, you could instead turn to courtly love. This wasn't for the common household and instead was for members of the court, but it allowed the lords and ladies of the time to experience love and courtship despite what their marital status might be. Yeah, it was a place for married people to go and hook up. Well, not entirely. I mean, there of course were rules in place and society was very pious, so people weren't exactly hooking up. But it was a huge hit. People danced, they giggled, they flirted, and sometimes people could even be caught holding hands. One of the rules of courtly love just stated, marriage is no real excuse for not loving.
And there you have it, folks. Those are the top 10 Dark Age traditions that will hopefully leave you confused or grossed out or feeling something. I've been your host, Taylor McWaters.
I've been your other host, Olivia Kozlowski, and we'll see you next time
on Bumblebee.
Bye.
Bye.